It's Christmas of 1918, and the future of Ukraine is once again uncertain. The toppling of the Hetman's government on the 14th had tossed the country into more chaos, as the Ukrainian National Republic experienced a violent rebirth. The new government, the five-man directory, had the stated goal of restoring democracy and freedom to the country, but in practice was a military junta in all but name. The Ukrainian National Army held de facto authority in the nation, and true democracy would likely never come to the country, at least not in this state. Further complicating matters was the sudden corner Ukraine found herself in. With the Germans no longer around to prop up an independent regime, the Bolshevik vultures circled once again, seeking to strike down the young republic permanently. Furthermore, the army of South Russia, now reorganized under General Denikin, also had its sights set on the country now that the pro-white hetman was no longer in charge. In the west, the upstart Polish Republic was maneuvering against the West Ukrainian breakaway state in Galicia that was nominally aligned with the UNR, and pushing against Ukraine's borders on the other end of the country. Ukraine was also invaded by the Entente, with French and British troops occupying Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kherson, and Sevastopol to support the White armies in the south. Even worse were the uprisings. The Revolutionary Insurgent Army of Ukraine had broken their very, very informal alliance with the UNA and declared de facto independence in the southeast of the country. Pro-Bolshevik uprisings had broken out, and Crimea had proclaimed an independent government. Ukraine was in for the fight of her life if she sought to continue her existence as a free nation, and the role of the Caesarian figure in these trying times would be taken by one Symon Petliura. Born on May 10th, or 22nd, of 1879 in the city of Poltava, his life had a dramatically different trajectory than Skoropadsky's did. Also, can I just say, his name is fucking Simon? Was nobody gonna tell me that? I've been calling him Semyon for like a year because I guess I just have severe brain damage or something. So, yeah, Symon Petliura. Symon Petliura was the son of a Cossack family, but they were much less nobility than Skoropadsky's family was. They were lower middle class before middle class existed, if that makes sense. The family lived in a small house in the suburbs of the city, with Petliura's father working as a coach driver. He was the third son out of 12 total children, leaving him with 8 siblings that survived infancy. His parents placed a very strong emphasis on Ukrainian traditions and customs, imbuing Petliura with a strong sense of nationalism from an early age. Unlike Skoropadsky, who was guided into the military by a long bloodline of military men, Petliura's original destination would see him take up the cross. Starting in 1892, he would attend a church school, later in 1895 entering the Poltava Theological Seminary with the intention of becoming a priest. As with many of the figures from this era, the allure of revolutionary ideologies struck the young man quite hard. Through his teens, he gradually became interested in revolutionary nationalism, liberalism, democracy, and the idea of the Ukrainian nation-state. This would lead to his association with the Hromadas beginning in 1898. Now, the Hromadas were a secret society that popped up after the Crimean War that promulgated the idea that maybe the Ukrainian people aren't just Russians that speak funny. They would lay the groundwork for a modern Ukrainian identity by encouraging self-education in Ukrainian culture, language, and history. Bigger Hromadas even went public, organizing cultural events and funding Sunday schools with the intention of establishing a Ukrainian identity across the country. They had a large degree of support amongst the educated and student classes within Ukrainian society, but never had a very large membership overall. This was because these groups were explicitly illegal within the Tsarist regime because Tsarists tend to be assholes. The Hromadas and people associated with them were often on the receiving end of vicious crackdowns. In 1876, the Ems Decree, issued by Alexander II, straight up banned the use of the Ukrainian language for most aspects of public life, along with banning the import of all books written in Ukrainian. As it turns out, this pissed off many Ukrainians and led many of the Hromadas to become radicalized and politically active, along with giving life to a broader Ukrainian national conscience. Petliura became active in the Poltava branch in 1898 and remained a nominal member until their dissolution later down the line. As it turned out, though, he was pretty fucking terrible at keeping the whole secret society thing a secret, and the seminary became aware of his associations, expelling him from the school in 1901. This wasn't the end of the world, though, because he had gotten enough of an education to be pretty well off going forward. Starting in 1900, he had also become involved with a more open and explicitly political group. On February 11th of that year, the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party popped into existence, being the first explicitly pro-sovereignty Ukrainian political organization. It initially advocated total independence for Ukraine as a social democracy. A few years later, this was changed to just autonomy within the Russian Empire, and Petliura was there from the very beginning. It was similar in function to the SRs, although with much less terrorism, and it slid in a much more explicitly Marxist direction as time went on. Petliura's association with this party got him in a shitload of trouble, and as a raid of arrests targeting leftist parties across the board hit, he was forced to flee his hometown to Krasnodar in late 1902, where he found some refuge amongst the Kuban Cossacks. Here, he would find some work as a teacher and as an archivist for the Kuban Cossack army for a bit. He continued his association with the RUP, electing to essentially join the propaganda division of the party. He would publish pamphlets and periodicals, and worked as an editor for several party publications over the years. It was this that would lead to his actual arrest in December of 1903, because freedom of speech is cringe and dumb and bad. Obviously, no freedom allowed in Tsarist Russia. He wasn't poor or an actual terrorist though, so he was able to make bail and not immediately be sent to Siberia. He took this opportunity, so graciously granted to him by the cops, to bounce once again, living his life on the run. He went to Kiev in April of 1904 and then moved to Lviv in Austria-Hungary in late September. Russia and Austria didn't like each other, so he was safe from prying eyes while in foreign territory. He remained there for several months, continuing his work on the party paper in the city. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party was in the process of imploding over ideological differences. A big chunk of the explicitly communist members fucked off to join the RSDRP after disagreements over whether Ukrainian parties should be represented independently from Russian ones when it came to socialist doctrine. You see, the mainstream Russian socialist parties, especially the RSDRP and especially the Bolshevik faction, had the idea that achieving socialism in the Russian Empire as a whole was paramount and that the national minorities needed to fall in line or risk ruining shit for everyone. This caused many splits within socialist parties on the topic of nationalism. So, when many in the RUP elected to stick with the whole national autonomy thing, the more traditionalist members left. This considerably weakened the party for a moment, but it did allow them to rebrand to the Ukrainian Social Democratic Labour Party, henceforth referred to as the USDRP. No relation. Anyways, the 1905 revolution rolls around, and suddenly he wasn't a criminal anymore. As a part of the reforms undertaken during the year, a general amnesty was offered for the majority of political prisoners, which included Petliura. Yay! He returned to Ukraine, spent a brief period in St. Petersburg helping the USDRP get established before moving back to Kiev, and then eventually to Moscow in 1909. All of this movement was largely because the feds kept shutting down his papers and threatening to arrest the guy repeatedly. The next year, he would actually get married to one Olga Bilska, a woman from Poltava he had met a few years earlier. She was attending Moscow University at the time, and the two would have one daughter named Lesya. He continued to find work in archival and accounting positions while continuing to edit various papers in his off time. Throughout his years, he also published many writings of his own and kept correspondence with many people. Gradually, folks began to recognize and respect his name as a man who stood for Ukraine in the face of Russian domination, and he began to achieve a certain status as a patriot and a leader. He is ultimately referred to most commonly as a journalist and a public figure before the war, largely for this reason. Speaking of war, well, war! You may have gathered by now that the primary through line between every person in this series I've talked about is that they were all involved in World War I in some capacity. It was kind of an important conflict. Kinda. Unlike Skoropadsky, Petliura was not super directly involved, and he didn't actually fight, but the conflict was still a major turning point. Initially, he advocated for Ukrainians to sort of earn their freedom, so to speak. He saw that the Ukrainians were faithfully and dutifully serving in the Tsar's army, and believed that this should cause the Russians to consider future autonomy for the country. In 1916, he would move to Minsk, where he joined the All-Russian Union of Zemstvos, which was essentially a civilian support group for the armies on the front lines, formed from both pre-existing Zemstvos and volunteers. Petliura showcased a particular talent for organization and bureaucratic efficiency, and was very quickly made, the word it used was plenipotentiary. But that's a big and scary word that my little brain struggles to handle, so he was the fucking chairman of the organization for the Western Front. Of course, though, one of the secondary themes of this series is that individual actions are not necessarily enough to turn the tides of history, and Russia got its ass beat in World War I, leading to a series of unfortunate events that led to the end of monarchy in Russia. Almost immediately following the February Revolution, Petliura saw an opportunity. Soldiers' councils were popping up everywhere, and he wasn't about to be left left out. He had a hand in establishing the first Ukrainian military committee on the front lines, this one dealing specifically with the Ukrainian soldiers in the more northern part of the front. He was obviously elected its leader, and was then elected to be the committee's delegate to the first All-Ukrainian Military Congress in May of 1917. He was promptly elected chairman of the General Military Committee. Let me remind you, this is a man with basically no frontline combat experience, and he was now the de facto head of the Provisional Ukrainian Military. Said military promptly declared total loyalty to the Central Rada after it popped into existence. Through May and June, Petliura was promoted to an official position, the General Secretary of Military Affairs and formal head of the new Ukrainian National Army, which he took to building from the ground up. Following through with Ukrainization plans, multiple new all-Ukrainian military formations were established under his oversight. Despite his lack of combat experience, his organizational talents actually made him very well suited to this specific role, especially with folks like Skoropadsky being able to bring their military talents to bear on the actual combat readiness front. However, as we have firmly established by this point, competence has more often than not been something you would be punished for throughout history. In Petliura's case, he got into repeated spats with members of the Central Rada over the direction of the Ukrainian military. Specifically mentioned is Volodymyr Vinnychenko, a writer, cultural icon, and very prominent figure in the Ukrainian revolutionary movement. Vinnychenko generally took a very conciliatory stance with just about everyone. He was the kind of guy who thought he could negotiate his way out of all conflict, and thus didn't see the need for a strong Ukrainian military. Now, I'm not gonna directly state that he was an idiot, but I am going to imply that he was, because come on. This would directly lead to Petliura fucking off for a while, opting to go and raise military formations personally without Vinnychenko's bitching. Petliura was still used for his skills, however. He was a part of the teams that negotiated with both the provisional government in Petrograd and with many a rowdy soldier that revolted in favor of total independence for Ukraine after the Rada elected to stick with home rule. The main thing to take away from that previous paragraph is that Petliura was now a big figure. He notably commanded the attention and respect of the UNA, along with big chunks of the population and the less pacifistic members of the Central Rada. Being at least a nominal socialist made him also fit with the general ideological wind that was sweeping the country, further strengthening his position. This all combined to make him one of the most powerful and influential guys in the nation by October of 1917. So, when the Bolsheviks did the funny and began seizing control of Russia, the soldiers listened to Petliura. When the Ukrainian National Republic was proclaimed and Petliura requested the loyalty of the soldiers, they listened. When Petliura ordered them to disarm the openly pro-Bolshevik formations, they listened. When Petliura ordered the Kiev Red Guard crushed and demobilized, they listened. And when he ordered several insurrections crushed with the help of Skoropadsky to drive the Reds from Ukraine, they listened. But remember that bit about competence being punished? Well, he and Skoropadsky both resigned around the same time in December of 1917. In Petliura's case, it was Vinnychenko blaming him for starting the war with the Bolsheviks that he believed could be avoided if everyone just got along and sang Kumbaya. He was pinned for a mythical reactionary conspiracy with the army to overthrow the Rada or something, you know, the Kerensky approach. So Petliura essentially went, fine, I'll do it myself, fucking off and raising a new army in the Kharkiv region to prepare for the inevitable Bolshevik invasion, while the Rada did jack diddly fuck all trying to negotiate with them. This would become known as the Haidamaki Battalion, a formation that would come to prove shockingly effective in the coming months. Petliura's first real military actions as a commander occurred in the Poltava region, but afterwards he was forced to withdraw and crush the January uprising in Kiev. He was an old-school kind of commander, leading from the front and commanding his troops personally. As we know, Kiev was forced to be abandoned regardless, and Petliura withdrew west, where he linked up with the German army. The Germans helped the UNR counterattack with Operation Faustschlag, and the Reds would be forcibly driven from the country by March of 1918. But once again, the Rada freaked out and used Petliura's popularity to accuse him of being involved in a right-wing reactionary conspiracy, this time straight up firing him from his command of the Haidamaki Battalion. Now, the particularly astute viewers among you may understand the irony of this situation. There was, in fact, a right-wing reactionary conspiracy to overthrow the government, but Petliura was definitely not the guy who was leading it. In fact, he was probably the one guy who could have prevented it. Said conspiracy goes off without a hitch in April of 1918, and Pavlo Skoropadsky takes over the country. Being rather, anti-whatever the fuck the Ukrainian state was, Petliura immediately took to undermining the hetman's rule. He headed the All-Ukrainian Union of Zemstvos, an organization dedicated to keeping the hetman in check with the peasants in mind, which he had founded immediately after the coup. It was here where many Ukrainians began to see Petliura as a larger-than-life figure who could potentially liberate the nation fully. He was a man of action, unlike those in the old UNR administration, and as such, his call for national and social liberation was heeded by many Ukrainians across the country. Well, Skoropadsky was kinda pissed about this whole situation and decided to take action to hopefully nip this in the butt before it became a problem. In July, he had Petliura arrested for his presenting of a petition that called for the Hetmanist land reforms to be reversed and property to be returned to the peasantry. He would sit in jail for most of the rest of the year. However, Petliura was a man of action, and he had just been martyred. Not only did large parts of the Ukrainian population begin demanding his release, but he also had managed to make some friends in incredibly high places. He had managed to gain contact with several prominent German socialist figures who put a shitload of pressure on the German government to demand Petliura's release. Since Germany was actively destabilizing at this moment, they relented, and soon Skoropadsky was basically forced to let the guy go on November 12th of 1918. Petliura thanked him for this act of reconciliation by going to Bilasurka and immediately organizing an uprising. He went there specifically because it was where a certain Yevhen Konovalets, commander of the Sich Riflemen, a formation consisting of over 1,200 men, was stationed. In Bilasurka, he also met with Vinnychenko and other members of the former government. Following Skoropadsky's declaration of a future union between Russia and Ukraine, they acted. On November 14th, the Directory of the Ukrainian National Republic was established to be led by a 5-man council consisting of Volodymyr Vinnychenko, Fedor Shevets, Opanas Andrievsky, Andriy Marenko, and Symon Petliura. Petliura took command of the Sich Riflemen and the military apparatus of the Directory, adopting the title of Chief Otaman. To the Hetmanists, they presented simple demands: return of land to the peasants, annulment of any federal relationship with Russia, and the return of democracy to the country. On November 17th, the German garrison at Bilasurka was disarmed, and the UNA began its march to Kiev. Several weeks of fighting ensued, with large parts of the Hetman's army defecting to Petliura's troops. By December 12th, over 30,000 men across Ukraine had heeded the Ottoman's call. By the 14th, Kiev had been taken, and by the 20th, the Ukrainian National Republic reigned over the lands of Ukraine once again. However, matters were complicated by the sudden corner Ukraine found herself in. With the Germans no longer around to prop up an independent regime, the Bolshevik vultures circled once again, seeking to strike down the young republic permanently. The ink on the manifestos had hardly dried before the Bolsheviks invaded in mid-December, although smaller advances in the east had taken place as early as November. Led by Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko and to a lesser degree Big J Stalin, they faced a small and disorganized Ukrainian national army and made quick progress. Vinnychenko, let it be known, was a man of principle. You bet your ass the Reds received several strongly worded letters condemning this invasion. Eventually, Petliura went over his head and sent them a war declaration just so that he could actually do stuff. However, their delay had proven costly. Much of the left bank had fallen by February, and once again, Kiev was in the Red Army's sights, with them taking the city on February 5th. This fiasco prompted Vinnychenko to officially resign from politics and fuck off to another country, handing the reins to seemingly the only motherfucker who knew what the fuck they were doing. Petliura was promptly given near-dictatorial emergency powers to try and save Ukraine. There isn't much to say about the Petliurist regime, since it spent most of its time trying not to die, but I will spare a few words. The new UNR basically continued the policies of the first, passing some land socialization bills, establishing a Ukrainian banking system, and attempting to gain recognition and assistance from every possible country. Petliura also made efforts to continue Ukrainization and promote Ukrainian institutions, building off of Skoropadsky's work. All good stuff. Of course, though, the UNR had many internal issues that made this kinda difficult. Governments cycled constantly. Every now and then an upstart officer would attempt a coup or stage an uprising, and order struggled to be maintained. Petliura also became known by many of his opponents as a rather indecisive fellow who flip-flopped on many of his beliefs and policies. In order to quash resistance, Petliura resorted to using his dictatorial powers, and dozens of political opponents would be executed between 1919 and 1920. One notable individual was Petro Bolbochan, a hero of the war against the Bolsheviks, up to the point where he was court-martialed and shot for daring to critique Petliura's running of things. Petliura's singular goal became the winning of the war at all costs, which meant that most other aspects of society were sacrificed. Essentially, the UNR was held together with duct tape, WD-40, and bullets, making it hard to judge them as a serious attempt at state building. Anyways, after taking Kiev, the Bolsheviks struck southwest towards Berdychiv and Kozyatan. This advance was initially checked, and Petliura was able to counterattack and catch the Reds off guard, nearly retaking Kiev by April. However, fortune favors the bold, and the Reds turned around and counterattacked the moment the Ukrainians ran out of steam. This attack proved utterly devastating, with Red Army units smashing south towards Vinnytsia and Zhmarinka through April, splitting the outnumbered UNA in two. Faced with multiple regional command defections, the southern group was forced to withdraw into Romania, where they would rejoin the western group at a later time. Now backed into a corner, Petliura's troops were promptly attacked from the rear by the Polish army, which had its sights on Lubin. Lutsk. Petliura was forced to make peace with Poland, condemning the West Ukrainian People's Republic in Galicia to die in exchange for a promise of not crushing the UNR between the rock and the hard place. By June, the Reds had taken Rivne, Vinnytsia, and Kamianets-Podilsky, although that last one would be regained quickly before the front line had stabilized. Taking 30 seconds to breathe, Petliura assessed the situation. He was the dictator of nothing by this point, but he had one advantage over the Reds: Ukraine. As they say, Ukraine is a land of partisans, and now was no exception. The Bolsheviks couldn't help themselves from being assholes, and their policies of forced requisitioning of food and industrial products, along with many instances of being dicks to Ukrainians for no reason, caused partisan activity to explode, and the UNA received many recruits, by mid-July numbering over 85,000. Furthermore, Ukraine is fucking massive, and the still young Red Army was being fucked over by its supreme bigness. They had outrun their supply chains, and their troops were exhausted. Any other man might have waited and prepared to ensure that they could survive against the future Red onslaughts, but Petliura is a man of action. The fighting in July saw the UNR actually regain parts of Podelia, and beginning in August, the big counterattack began. They took Vinnytsia on August 12th, and over the next 20 days carved a swath towards Kiev, arriving on August 31st. They came prepared to fuck up the Reds, only to find that Anton Denikin was already there. What? Yeah, Anton Denikin did the funny and made, in my opinion at least, the biggest strategic fuck-up of his career and had invaded Ukraine. This was mainly done to secure the left flank of his drive on Moscow, but in practice all it had done was piss off the anarchists and give him a shitload of territory that he needed to commit valuable resources to defend and control that couldn't really give him much in return. I mean, I can kinda see where he was coming from. When you were shown a perfectly kickable nest of hornets, you are just compelled to kick it, right? Would be a waste to not. The Whites had taken Kiev on the 30th, and the Reds had been mostly driven from the country for the third time for those who have been counting. The UNA and the Whites nearly went to war right then and there, but Petliura elected to temporarily swallow his pride and withdrew from Kiev. This did cause a split in Petliura's forces, as the Ukrainian Galician army wanted to collaborate with Denikin against the Bolsheviks, a concept that the strongly nationalist Petliura refused outright. So, when Denikin inevitably got BTFO'd, Ukraine was on her own. BTFO'd they were, and alone she was. Interestingly though, it wasn't a military confrontation that destroyed the UNA for good. It was good old general disease. In the fall of 1919, a typhoid epidemic swept through the military and annihilated it. Upwards of 70% of the entire UNA would be affected, and due to the state of Ukraine at the time, many of these cases would prove fatal. The Bolsheviks would rebound and capitalize on this, reversing the situation once again after they had dislodged the Whites from most of their conquered areas. Eventually, on December 4th, the UNA elected to abandon conventional warfare for the time being and resort to partisanship, while Petliura and what was left of the Republican government fled to Poland to try and negotiate. In effect, the Ukrainian National Republic had ceased to exist. These partisans would operate behind Bolshevik lines for multiple years in events known as the Winter Campaigns. Petliura kinda just lurked in Warsaw for a few months while he tried to get Poland to help him out. Previous attempts to do this earlier in 1919 went nowhere because nobody could quite agree on the status of East Galicia, which, as you may recall, was in the process of being destroyed by Poland. After several meetings with Józef Piłsudski and the foreign minister expressing willingness to make some concessions, the Treaty of Warsaw was hammered out on April 21st of 1920. Poland promised military assistance and recognition of Ukraine in exchange for everything west of this river, and the UNR dropping its claims to everything. Polish landowners in Ukraine would have to be protected, and both sides agreed to the protection of national minorities, which was basically unenforced, and everyone was still an asshole. It was comparatively humiliating after everything Ukraine had fought through, but Petliura wasn't exactly in a position to bargain. This caused outrage amongst many, and the entire government of the UNR resigned in protest, but what's done is done. A few days later, the Polish army, backed by the UNA, struck east once more. Most of this you already know by now, and if not, I have 2 videos that discuss this particular part in great detail. They took Kiev, then they didn't take Kiev, then got absolutely railed, then the Reds got cocky and nearly killed each other, then fucked up and saw a third of their army nearly cease to exist. Petliura was there the entire way, and UNA forces did participate in the defense of Lvov and the Battle of Warsaw, and the counterattacks that followed. Alas, a free Ukraine was not to be had from this particular war. The Treaty of Riga set the border between Poland and the Soviets to be roughly what the planned Ukrainian border would have been, and Ukraine was left to die as a consequence. In November of 1920, most remaining UNA forces were allowed to withdraw into Poland, where they were disarmed and interned as a part of the treaty. Petliura's government remained in Poland for a few years, retaining its claim to being the true government of Ukraine before increasing demands from the Reds to extradite him forced him to flee for Hungary, then to France, where his government in exile would settle. Now, I would be rather remiss if I didn't mention the thing a lot of you are probably thinking about. On February 15th of 1919, the town of Proskurov, now Khmelnytsky, was occupied by a group of Ukrainian paramilitaries after a local Bolshevik uprising was crushed. Their leader, a man named Ivan Semisenko, elected to punish the population for trying to side with the Reds. In a few hours, between 1,000 and 1,700 Jewish civilians would be murdered in cold blood. This was far from an isolated incident. The Russian Civil War had a huge number of pogroms during its runtime, with thousands documented between 1917 and 1923. Antisemitism had existed for centuries under the Tsarist regime, and this translated over to the combatants of the Civil War with tragic consequences. By the end, over 80,000 Jews would be directly killed, and another 100,000+ would be permanently injured or die later from injuries sustained in these incidents. Note that these numbers are heavily debated, and many claim them to be higher or lower. Other pogroms specifically targeted property owned by Jews, leading to hundreds of thousands of dollars of damages and many injuries to those that tried to defend their homes. Every side of the conflict carried them out for one reason or another, most commonly for accusations of supporting the enemy. The biggest perpetrator was naturally the White Army, which consistently displayed extreme anti-Semitism, especially amongst the Cossacks. The mere accusation of being a Bolshevist sympathizer was enough to have you shot, tortured, or forcibly displaced, and this accusation was disproportionately levied on the Jewish population, due to many in the Bolshevik leadership being Jews themselves. The Reds weren't much better. After the October Revolution through the spring of 1918, the Red Guards and Red Army would carry out dozens of their own attacks on Jewish populations, and their invasion of Ukraine saw them carry out dozens more upon the Ukrainian Jewish population. Hundreds of attacks would also be carried out by non-aligned groups. Oftentimes, groups of civilians would get together to find someone to blame their hardships on, and that blame more often than not fell upon the Jews. Nowhere more were Jews persecuted than in Ukraine, however. The collapse of Tsarist Russia and the chaos that followed led to a huge spike in pogroms in the country as order broke down. On paper, Ukrainian Jews enjoyed great autonomy and many rights and protections as a part of various laws passed by the Central Rada and the UNR. However, this conflicted heavily with reality on the ground. Again, estimates vary, but the number seems to be between 40 and 50% of the several hundred pogroms carried out during the conflict in Ukraine being carried out by the Ukrainian National Army, or militia aligned with the UNA. The remainder of that number was filled in mostly by the Red Army and the White Army, with assorted independent warlords carrying out the rest. In some instances, these acts of violence were seemingly random, but in many others, there were direct orders from ranking officers to carry them out. Justifications were usually the same as they were elsewhere. Jews were supporting the enemy, Jews were hoarding resources, etc. Everything taken together, the final tallies amount to over 40,000 dead on the low end in Ukraine alone. Given the scale of this tragedy, it has naturally led to much debate over the role the chief Otaman played in all of this. To summarize a lot of reading, the general consensus seems to be that, while Petliura himself may not have been actively participating in pogroms, and wasn't necessarily an extreme anti-Semite himself, he absolutely enabled those who were, turning a blind eye to many of these violent crimes and even intervening to politically protect some of their perpetrators. His failure to effectively crack down on anti-Jewish violence made him at minimum complicit and at most directly responsible for the amount of death that occurred in his country. By mid-1919, the problem had gotten so bad in Ukraine that it was starting to cause genuine issues with both national legitimacy and the perception of the republic amongst the population, prompting Petliura to issue a formal ordinance condemning these actions on August 26th. He also took other actions like introducing the death penalty for such crimes, however in practice this wasn't utilized very often. It often came down to bigger concerns, and punishing pogroms simply fell lower on the totem pole in Petliura's eyes compared to the fight for national survival. As such, for the most part, he was simply indifferent, a silence that allowed these crimes to go basically unpunished, and even encouraged by more radical nationalist officers who remained untouched. Thus, it has been argued that this makes him entirely guilty. Semisenko would eventually be executed, but not until late 1920, and it's believed that it was because he challenged Petliura's leadership and Proskurov was used as a justification to get rid of him. But for every Semisenko, there were many perpetrators that simply never faced justice. And on that note, Petliura, having been defeated, fled Ukraine. In 1924, he would settle in Paris permanently. He essentially went back to his status as a journalist and publicist. He remained in charge of the UNR in exile, but his role at this point was largely ceremonial. The sting of complete defeat delegitimized his government quite considerably, and as such, he struggled to attract a large support base amongst Ukrainian emigres. Many also saw him as a traitor for selling the country out to Poland, which didn't help his case. Nevertheless, he soldiered on. Once in Paris, he founded the paper Trezub. This was an emigre newspaper and served as the mouthpiece of the UNR in exile and gave Petliura the opportunity to express his views and messages to the Ukrainian people. He spent the next couple of years doing just that, publishing many statements, writings, and and articles. He also spent a lot of time taking the piss out of the Bolsheviks and the rule of Ukraine, which is, fair. He was chillin' and having an okay time despite being surrounded by the French until he was, rather abruptly, fucking assassinated on May 25th of 1926. Yep. We're gonna talk about this because the whole situation is kinda insane. A fellow by the name of Samuel Schwarzbard was the one that pulled the trigger. He was a Jew from Odessa that fought for the Bolsheviks and had lost several family members in a pogrom in 1919, and he held Petliura directly responsible, vowing to avenge his family and his people one way or another. He began planning the hit in 1924 after ending up in France, which he would carry out in 1926 when the moment struck. He had originally planned to kill him at a party hosted by the emigre community marking Petliura's birthday on the 10th, but he would apparently be stopped and talked down by, and take this with a grain of salt, Nestor motherfucking Makhno. Yeah, apparently Petliura and Makhno were actually on decent terms, and Makhno stopped Schwarzbard from pulling the trigger that night. Small fucking world, what can I say? This didn't save Petliura in the long run though, and on the 25th, Schwarzbard walked up to him and shot him 7 times, killing him on the spot. He was 47 years old. The trial that followed was very goofy. Schwarzbard submitted himself to police custody, and in any other country he probably would have been hanged for his crime. But the Dreyfus affair still occupied a part of the national consciousness. When the trial commenced in 1927, huge emphasis was placed on the pogroms in Ukraine, and Schwarzbard was portrayed as a heroic avenger. The defense counsel also pulled the Think of France card. The jury deliberated for 35 minutes before coming back with a resounding not guilty. He shot a man dead in the middle of Paris and got away with it. Not only that, but Petliura's family was ordered to pay for the costs of the trial, and his wife was given no compensation for the death of her husband. Ouch. The verdict made the leftists in France happy, but pissed off an equally large number of people and became a point of contention in French politics and Franco-Soviet relations for a while. There were also several claims that this was orchestrated by the GPU to bump off Petliura, which, it definitely could have been. Either way, what was done was done. Schwarzbard fucked off to South Africa, where he died a decade later, bringing a definitive end to Petliura's tale. So, now I get to talk about legacy by asking the same question I asked with Skoropadsky. Even more so than Skoropadsky, though, Petliura is complicated. He reigned as essentially a military dictator, and despite holding progressive and moderate socialist beliefs, he never really got the chance to make any big impacts on the people of Ukraine. Being in a literal constant state of warfare for your entire existence doesn't exactly bode well for effective policy implementation. But Petliura, true to his words, at least tried. He primarily focused on continued promotion of Ukrainian culture and the forging of a cohesive Ukrainian national identity. And through all of the war and bloodshed, he did kinda succeed. Furthermore, his leadership capabilities in holding the UNA together through all of its struggles proved shockingly effective, and in years following his assassination, his likeness emerged as a primary symbol of Ukrainian nationalism and independence. He was a man of action and will, and fought as long as he could to try and see Ukraine free. On the other hand, for many, especially on the left and amongst Jewish communities, he is nothing short of a monster, a butcher, and a warmonger. Soviet portrayals of the man in years following were not kind, making him out as a bourgeois traitor to the Ukrainian and Russian people. Global Jewish organizations also take every opportunity to denounce the guy for his role in the violence during the UNR years. For them, Petliura has the blood of tens of thousands of innocent Jewish people on his hands, and honestly, this idea is entirely justified. For all his capabilities, his complete failure to hold his own people accountable makes him out to be either incompetent or outright malicious, and thus his portrayal as a Ukrainian hero has drawn considerable criticism. Generally though, in Ukraine at least, perceptions of the man seemed positive. He has many statues and streets named for him, and there are even several folk songs and apparently an epic poem composed in his honor. He occupies much less of the public eye due to his association with the pogroms, but he remains a powerful symbol of Ukrainian resistance and independence, which, I suppose, is a better legacy than some have had. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.